what's happening in the Middle East today and the inequity between how Jews are treated in these countries in North Africa and what's going on with the Palestinians and so on. So my question is dealing with Morocco, specifically Morocco, because it's one of the few Muslim Arab countries I visited, and besides Algeria and others. But my question is dealing with what happened with the emigration of the Jewish community. When I've heard many accounts of what happened in 48, 47, 48, 49, that the Israeli government was involved in this immigration, that they were never forced out of Morocco. I'm just repeating what I heard, so I'm hoping to get some truth. There was agents of the Israeli government making arrangements, etc., because the Moroccans Jews were supposedly going to be used for agricultural, to work in the lands of Israel. So maybe these two gentlemen, scholars, will be able to shed some light exactly what did happen during this period. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe Professor Stillman? Okay.
The immigration from Morocco is somewhat complicated. There were Jews who, in the enthusiasm of the founding of the State of Israel, who did immigrate right away. They were not actually very enthusiastically welcomed, especially as Israel took in so many people, over 2.5 times the amount of people living there, because the North African Jews were not in danger the way Jews in Iraq were in Syria and other Middle Eastern countries. They also established what they called selective immigration, selectia, and they wanted to keep down the number. Also, there was, in newspapers like Haaretz and so on, they were rather unkind descriptions of North Africans as compared to other Middle Eastern Jews. And as of 1952 on, only families that had a clear breadwinner and where everyone was healthy was able to emigrate. Then, when both Morocco and Tunisia were about to become independent, there was a great deal of worry. There were anti-Jewish incidents, although not many, but there were a number of serious ones. And then, of course, you had a large number that wanted to come before Morocco became independent. And then you have another. Morocco had about 250 to 300,000 Jews. About 20,000 came right at the time of the foundation of the state. But then, when Morocco was about to become independent, nearly 50,000 who began to panic, seeing what Arab nationalism was. And sure enough, as soon as Morocco became independent, not only did the gates to emigration close, but all contacts, for example, with relatives in the State of Israel by mail were now stopped. And then you had clandestine immigration. And then it was it 61 or 62? 62.
61 till 64,
No, but the sinking of the Pisces. January of 62, right. And there was an incident of a ship of clandestine emigres that sank. It was terrible publicity for the Moroccan state, and at the same time, it was at the time when King Mohammed V was dying. After this incident, they allowed open immigration. Another huge wave left, and then, of course, with each war in the Middle East, it became more and more difficult. My wife, whose family was in Morocco up until well, she still has relatives there now, said that with the 67 war, suddenly in the schools, nobody would speak to them, and so on. And this was a very integrated family. And then with each war, I started working there in 71. With the 73, there were still 20,000 Jews in the country at the time. 73 war, and after that, the number dropped precipitously down to 10,000 in half, and then it just began to seep away. Young people went to study abroad, never came back. And today, of course, there's only about 3,000 to 3,500 Jews in the country.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, bevakasha, please give it.
I want to thank both speakers for very interesting papers. And it seems from both papers that the main reason that Jews left many Arab countries, especially in North Africa, was that they were either formally allied with or at least part of the European cultural milieu. But my question is, to what extent were they? In other words, obviously there were Jews who were, who had adopted French language and culture and some kind of French identity. But what percentage, right? I mean, was it just the intellectuals or the wealthy? What percentage of Jews were part of that world? And then sort of a secondary question is, both of you have really discussed the Francophone Middle Eastern world. What about the Anglophone world? Was there a difference between those Jews? I mean, of course there was a difference, but I mean, what was the difference in those colonies or protectorates of Great Britain? Like, I mean, the situation surely was different. So I was wondering if both of you actually could speak to those issues.
Thank you for your questions. It's a very complicated question, or complicated to explain, because modernity differentiated from in each country. It is not the same. I'm specialist from North Africa, but I think it's in all other Muslim countries. It's differentiated from country to country, and in each country there was differences between some parts of the Jewish populations. It is well known that in Algeria most of the Jews were French citizens, and their process of modernization was much bigger than the process of modernization of the Muslim society there. Yes, in Tunisia, half of the Jewish population, not half, a quarter of the Jewish population had or French citizenships or Italian citizenships. It's about 20-25% of the population. And they were the most modernized in Tunisia. In Morocco, it's more complicated because in Morocco there was no process of giving them any possibility to have the French citizenship. So they stayed in a very restricted process of modernization, that they could be French as they wanted, but not with the French citizenship. So it means that it was a restricted process in Morocco. So those are the differences between those three countries. But I think that the main important factor that I want to add to this debate is that Jews left, especially the elites of the Jews, left at the moment they realize that there is a big difference between the modernizations of the Jews, the level of modernization of the Jews, and the Muslim population. And in this time, in this moment, they understood that they cannot stay in this country. For example, if the law now was the Muslim laws and not the French law, that means that a lawyer that wants to go to the court must take with him a translator that will translate it from French to Arabic. This was new. It was new for the medicine, for the doctors. It was new for the lawyers in those countries. So they began to understand that they cannot stay anymore in those countries. And they realized it more and more from year to year. So it was at the least that they were obliged to leave those countries. And for the first question, just to add you something I think it's important. Look, there is no difference between what the Zionist movement did in Europe before World War II and even a little after, till the 50s, or in Soviet Union and in Muslim countries. I don't see any difference between these activities. This is the same. This is the same pattern. This was the ideology of the Zionist movement.
Yeah.
Yes, just to add quickly.
Can I use the microphone?
A microphone, if you can get it. Okay.
Just to add quickly on Morocco, that the majority of Moroccan Jews were not as, I mean, only 10% of Algerian Jews went to Israel. They had citizenship. They had French education. They did not go to the Alliance Israelite schools. They went to French public schools. And by the way, in greater numbers than even the Pieds Noirs, the Muslims certainly, but even the Pieds Noirs, the colonists, and so their percentages to get university, because the only university in North Africa was in Algiers, and the percentage of Jews was in many of the faculties was something like 15% and so on, even though they were a tiny percentage of the population. In Morocco, the French were very afraid, according to their statistics, only 40% of Moroccan Jews were really Francophone, but of course it was much higher than that. But the urban Jews of Morocco looked, to use their expression at France, as the patrie adoptée, and the adopted homeland. And as for the English-speaking, say Egypt, Iraq, and so on, French was still the language of the educated, because there they did go to French schools. So it wasn't any different.
A microphone. The mic is, I believe it's already there. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey Herf in the history department. Professor Stillman, if I understood you correctly, you focused as a cause of the immigration on the conflict between the nature of Arab nationalism and the prospects for Jews in a post-colonial North Africa. That is, ironically, colonialism had meant more equality for Christians and Jews in a Muslim context, and the Jews in North Africa feared that decolonization would be a return to a subordinate status. So first, did I understand you correctly? And second, there is an argument that one hears in departments or scholars from Middle East studies that the basic reason why Jewish communal life in the Arab lands ended was the establishment of the State of Israel. That this was the original sin, and that in a way the Jews got what they deserved for this horrible sin of establishing a Jewish state. That does not give much causal weight to the indigenous cultural and political and economic forces that the two of you were discussing. So I wondered if you could address that second thesis and also the first question.
That definitely is a thesis.
We have more. If you could be a little bit short, because I see that we have many questions. I want to give the opportunity to each one of them. Okay, Rega, just a minute, yes.
And it's the regnant thesis, for example, in the Middle East Studies Association of North America, which started its BDS vote back 2 years ago, and which those of us who opposed it lost. Then its next vote was to remove from its bylaws that it was a non-political academic organization. They thought non-political was too limiting. That is a very ideological point of view. And by the way, it's not merely North Africa. Take the example of Iraq, which had certainly the wealthiest and the best educated Jewish community in the entire spectrum of the Arab world. But it was also one of the centers of Arab nationalism. Sati al-Husri, one of the great figures of Arab nationalism, was there. The Mufti, after the Arab revolt of 1936 to 39, was there. And as I said, it became an ally of Germany for a short period. There, it was quite clear that there was no future. It was no future for them. So it was not merely North Africa. And in fact, in North Africa, the situation was somewhat better than it was in any of the Middle Eastern countries.
Okay, please.
Hi, Harold Road. Question, please. Yeah, for either of you, the Berbers. Today, a lot of even Moroccan diplomats that are of Berber origin are trying to make connections with Jews, with North African Jews, with all of us. The question is, what was it in the past? And I think one of you had mentioned that the problem was that they needed to take a French-Arabic translator. The Muslims in that part of the world really didn't know Arabic. They spoke a dialect which was completely different from anything in written Arabic. Until it was Palestinians who basically came in the 50s, or what we call today Palestinians, or Egyptians, to indoctrinate them into Arab nationalism. It was Islam that mattered. Am I wrong?
Just to understand what is the questions.
What is the relationship today, or even back then, with
Today,
the Jews and the Berbers?
Jews and the Berber in the past I can talk. Today, I don't know, I'm not a diplomat, I don't know about what's going today. But look, Jews and Berber relationships were, as far as we know, till today from the research that was made by many scholars, anthropologists, by sociologists, yes, were better than the relationships between the Arabs and the Jews in the main central cities in North Africa mainly, but in Morocco, there were 35% of the populations in Morocco. But I think that the most important problem of the Berbers in Morocco is their relationships with the king, with the Sultan of Morocco. This is an internal problem and not a Jewish problem. They left those villages in which they lived because they knew that for them, yes, this was the dream that they dreamed all the time to come to the state of Israel. They were there just waiting for the time that they can come. So at the moment that Morocco gets its independence, it was clearly for them that they will leave those villages, that they will leave the Atlas Mountains, yes? And we have evidence, very interesting evidence that emissaries of the Mossad went throughout all the villages from 1955 to from 1961 to 1964, and we have today all the detail on each village and the numbers of the families, the numbers in each family of the children, the names, the professions, etc., etc. Yes, and it was done during this period. I mean, it was done during the period that Morocco was independent. Yes, and it was no problem between the relationships between Jews and Muslims and the Berber in this. So I don't find any problem there.
Saadoun. Okay, yes, please. Take the mic.
My name is Dr. Gary Schiff. Two small questions. You spoke, both of you, about the relationship between the Jews and the Muslims, the Muslims and the Christians in North Africa, particularly Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia. Studying the French history of the Third Republic and beyond that, I found that the most Algeria was the only part of metropolitan France. So only, am I correct? So only Algerians voted for the French National Assembly. The most anti-Semitic members of the French National Assembly were the representatives from Algeria, who were the Pieds Noirs, who were the Spanish, Italian, French, Christian immigrants to Algeria. They were jealous that the French even made them citizens. So could you speak a little bit about that dynamic? They were fascist beyond words. And the second point I have is that day I attended a conference on the Jews of Salonika, Greece. Now, they weren't part of the Arab world, but they were part of the Ottoman Empire until there were Sephardic Jews who were part of the Ottoman Empire until 1912 or thereabouts. And they, too, had this similar crisis of identity where many of them modernized, went to Alliance schools, felt Greek, although they spoke French and Greek, but also spoke Ladino, published newspapers in Ladino and Greek, and et cetera, et cetera. But many of them, when they were killed, sang the Greek national anthem. There was a copy of a Siddur that was published in Salonika in 1941, right before the Jews were all sent to Auschwitz, by Bnei Akiva, religious Zionist socialists who sang the Greek national anthem. So it's a very similar kind of dynamic.
Yeah, we have, you want to have, no, yeah, you can ask, yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if you could share, I'm Neil Rubin from Bethel High School in Baltimore. I was wondering if you could share with us if there were any examples of Christian and Muslim elite trying to work with Jewish elite to keep the communities in any of these venues, because clearly they had much to lose as well.
No.
Well, in Morocco, after, as Morocco was becoming independent, there were a number of Jewish intellectuals who did try to encourage working in the new Morocco. There was an organization called Al-Wifaq, being together, cooperation, which was not very successful. That was really one of the best examples. I don't know about Tunisia, right? And you had, as I said, a number of intellectuals who wrote articles and books about our place in the new Morocco. And for a while, because there was a complete lack of middle-level bureaucrats who knew, for example, who knew French and so on, Jews held positions. There was a Jew in the first Moroccan cabinet, as there was in the first independent Tunisian cabinet. That was, a few years later, that was it. And people began to see that this was not going the way they had hoped.
Okay. Thank you. I want to ask the last question, because we get the impression right now we were talking mainly about North African Jewry in this session. And we know that people were forced to leave in Iraq. Jewish people in 1 year, as a matter of fact, 1951, all of them left. And then almost 135,000 people left Iraq. The same thing, maybe in 2-3 parts in Libya, also were forced to leave. Also in Egypt. I don't think in Yemen they were forced to leave. They reached an agreement with Yahya, but in Egypt we know. Morocco it's something, North Africa it's a little bit, but the result is that everyone left. All these countries, we don't have any more Jews. As a matter of fact, just maybe a little bit in Morocco. Do you see any influence? You didn't speak about the influence, for example, of the Arab Leagues. The visit of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Morocco didn't have any kind of impact at that time about, let's say, stopping Aliyah, for example. So if you could really talk about a little bit about the influence. We know that the Arab League and other countries, but especially in North Africa, do you see any kind of influence, any kind of impact in North Africa, especially with the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser?
Of course, there was an impact of the Israeli-Arab conflict before the creation of the State of Israel and even after. But as you certainly know, there was a conflict even between Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Sultan of Morocco. They didn't see the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian problems at the same eyes. Even not Bourguiba and Gamal Abdel Nasser saw the problem at the same eyes. It's not the same solution that they found. Bourguiba was the first Arab leader that in 1964 in Jericho called for the compromise between Israel and the Palestinians and to create and to recognize the Israeli states. And it was different. It was not what Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted at that time. But there was an influence, a very big influence that was bigger from 1929 to the end of those communities of the Arab-Israeli conflict on those relationships, on the perceptions of the Jews, if they can or cannot stay in those countries. This is clear, I think. It's no question about it.
Absolutely. And I'll just add, since the comment before about the teachers who came with independence, they wanted to have what they called Arabization. even though everybody spoke Arabic, very few people, went to school. In Algeria, there was next to no Arabic education. Tunisia was the only country where there was more or less some. And many of who did they import to be? Because remember, Arabic society is a diglossic society. You read and write the classical language, you speak the vernacular, as it's like in that sense, Europe in the Middle Ages. And who could teach in these schools? There weren't enough native teachers. And so that's when they began to import Egyptians and others from the Middle East to do the teaching. And now also with the introduction of new textbooks, you have the beginning of really, and of course you already had it on the radio, militant Arab nationalism, which had a very strong, not merely anti-Zionist, but anti-Semitic element as well, and that changed things dramatically. King Mohammed V, Habib Bourguiba, they did not buy into all of that. But that became that. If you really want a very good book that I could, and because you also somebody asked about Berbers and Jews. My colleague Omar Boum, who's now out at UCLA, did a book called.
He was here, Omar Boum,
yes.
10 years ago in our conference here.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. Memories of Absence, and he went down to his native area in South Morocco. He's a Hartani, that is. Descendant of slaves, he's black, speaker of Berber and Arabic, and he, because people marry young, interviewed throughout the region 4 generations, great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and children, on their memories of Jews. Great-grandparents and grandparents had both very clear and very positive memories of their Jewish neighbors. The parents already somewhat hazy and not entirely positive. And the 4th generation, those who have internet access, go to school, and so on, had extremely negative and very much reflected Arab nationalist thought.
Okay, I think maybe we'll keep the other questions too late now. We have to go. I will give the chance to ask for the next sessions. So the next sessions will take us to Yemen, to Iraq, to Syria. It's another part of the world. So stay with us, and I want to thank